Kayce Jennings. I was in London at the London Bureau for ABC from 1982 until 1986. I was in London as a student and started at ABC as an unpaid slave. I was lucky enough to get to hang around, and it was a remarkable time there. As the rest of you who were there then remember, lots of things were happening in the world. It was a time when network television was covering the world and caring about the world and spending a lot of money to do it, and allowing the neophytes to learn on the job, which was a remarkable time. When I first started, I was sort of a researcher-ish person. Eileen O'Connor and I sort of grew up together at ABC. The only place for us to sit at the time was the radio room, and poor John Donovan had to try to file radio in between our phone calls, or we had to try and make phone calls and book Nightline guests in between John's radio spots. So we were all sort of on top of each other, but it was all a lot of fun. At that time, most of the work, it was an amazing time. The Falklands War happened. Reagan came over to visit, a European trip, and then of course there was the invasion of Lebanon. So there was an enormous amount of news, an enormous amount of activity around. My job at the time, once the Falklands hit, was a lot of it was Nightline related. We were booking Nightline guests pretty much every night at the time. And I remember one time walking upstairs with a member of what was then called I think it was the Kitchen Cabinet. Was that what they called Thatcher's group there? Her small group of advisors. Cecil Parkinson was one of them. And I remember going up the stairs to do a Nightline pre-tape interview. It was still quite late at night, with Mrs. Parkinson chasing Carl Bernstein up the stairs, saying, "I don't care if you are Carl Watergate Bernstein, you're never going to call," I guess Bernstein, "you're never going to call my house at 2 o'clock in the morning again." Cecil Parkinson didn't feel quite that way. I think he liked being on TV, even American TV. So I did that for a while, and then I became an assignment editor on the assignment desk, and it wasn't a job I particularly wanted, but they needed to fill it. There was a staff job, and I remember telling Paul Friedman, who then ran things over there, that it wasn't a job I particularly wanted, and we agreed that I wouldn't take it permanently and it wouldn't be a staff job. And then I woke up one day and it was a staff job, and I had it. So I did that for a bit. And it was fun. I got to learn a lot by doing it, actually, because we were on the assignment desk there. We were in contact with everyone on every story throughout our coverage area. So it was actually a pretty great way to learn how things worked, and to get to know everyone. And from there, I got to go to Nightline, and I got to be the minion on the Nightline team. Tom Yellen was there then as the senior producer for Nightline, and later Betsy West. And that was, sort of a dream job. I didn't know a whole lot at the time about what I was doing. I'd worked as a newspaper reporter, but never in television until I started at ABC. And I had these wonderful teachers, in both Tom and Betsy, and we had. It's almost impossible to imagine the leeway we had and the things we got to do. To imagine that, I would get to go off places without a camera for several days at a time just to figure out what the story was. I remember going to Ireland when Reagan was going to be there, and he was going to dance around with leprechauns, and it was going to be all sort of a very light and fluffy trip. And we decided to do a story on the Ireland Reagan wouldn't see. And I think I went 2 separate trips for 3 or 4 days each just to figure out what that story was, what the real story in Ireland was. Same thing with, at the time, as a lot of folks will remember, the anti-nuclear movement was very big in Europe, particularly in Germany, but also in Britain. And there was going to be some 3-day event, protests in Germany. And again, I got to go off for, I don't remember how many days, 5 days a week, or a week, just to talk to people, just to meet all the factions involved in the protest movements, to figure out what the story actually was, as opposed to what we would tend to do now, is just have to figure it out while we're there, and therefore maybe get it wrong. So it was a pretty amazing time. The Troubles in Ireland were going on at the same time. still going on, I should say. The hunger strikers, the Bobby Sands hunger strike was happening. There were, I remember, well, and then of course the Israeli invasion. We were doing it for Nightline that night, a sort of light story. Wimbledon was going on, some of you might recall, and we were doing a story on what it's like for the guy ranked 200th in Wimbledon, because we were so used to hearing about the stars, and I don't even remember who they were at that time. And we were getting ready to pre-tape the interview when Shlomo Argov, the Israeli ambassador to London, was shot. And I think all our lives then changed for many years when the Israelis invaded Lebanon and that story took over. What about it? Was a fun time. We used to. I remember, on the light side of things, there was the touch football in Regent's Park. There were those god awful bacon sandwiches. Remember those? The only thing you could get to eat in the middle of the night on those late night, and they'd come in those like big pizza-like boxes with the grease just dripping through them. It was like white Wonder Bread and big slabby, greasy pieces of bacon, and they tasted so good, and they were so awful. There was, I don't know, everyone was there to teach you and to help you and to learn from each other. So every story was an adventure. I always felt, amazingly lucky. I'd be out with correspondents. Jack Lawrence and I would be driving to an interview, and we'd spend the entire hour and a half talking about every single question and making sure we had it formulated exactly right so that we would get the kind of, not the answer, because we didn't necessarily know what the answer is, but the kind of answer that we were looking for, that there wasn't an easy out to the question. The camera crews taught me so much. I remember I was thinking about this before during one of the anti-nuke demonstrations in London, being with Gentleman Jim Godfrey, as he was shooting, and all these women anarchists with their faces all with the bandanas on their faces were sitting there kicking him in the shins. And I remember, not a hair out of place, Jim just kept shooting. His ascot still perfectly tied with these, bandana covered people kicking at him. It was very funny. I think about being sent off at a moment's notice to Tunis to see if maybe we could get Arafat. In those days, now I don't think they send you any place unless you absolutely know what you're going to get for the most part. Yet in those days, they sent this green kid off to do things like that, and then gave us enormous support all around. There were, 8 people in New York making phone calls to Tunis, trying to set things up and make things happen, so that when I got there, it was easier. It was an exceptional time. There was no sort of cynicism. There was, the normal sort of journalist black humor and sort of humor cynicism, but not real cynicism, not the kinds we hear now. I don't think anyone doubted what we were doing mattered. I don't think anyone wondered about what we did or why we did what we did. I think there was a lot of passion about what we were doing, and I feel very, very lucky to have been part of that. People cared deeply about it. There was none of the sort of eye rolling about what we covered, because what we covered almost always was significant. I don't think that's just because we were overseas and covering sort of the biggest stories in the world. I think it was sort of a part of the times. It started to, there were also, God knows there were the extravagances about it. I remember once, it might have been when there was one of those incredible correspondence meetings and it was in Rome, and it was during the Super Bowl. And I remember getting a call like really late the day before, maybe it was the day before, I don't know, at some point, saying we needed to get Super Bowl programs to Rome, the actual real Super Bowl programs, because there was going to be some party for fancy people in Rome with I don't know, the ambassador, I don't know what, but Roone Arledge wanted programs, the real thing. And I remember there were like 8 people working on this across Europe and in the States, figuring out, and you can only imagine how much money it costs. Probably a job or two these days. I remember when it must have been during the Israeli invasion era, when the brass would come to town. Do you remember those food trucks, those fancy food trucks would suddenly emerge outside Carburton Street? And then the moment the brass left, so were the food trucks. I got to go finally to one of those correspondence meetings in Paris. And, you know, it was extravagant, but it was also sort of great because everyone there actually did hear from the correspondents and the producers, and there was an opportunity to exchange ideas and sort of understand what people were doing and needing. I'm just trying to think of, you know, I can't even, you know, here I literally was this green kid and I saw the world. I got to spend 2 weeks in Zimbabwe doing a story for Nightline with Jack Lawrence on 5 years after independence for American television. Can you imagine us getting 2 weeks now to do a story on the 5th anniversary of an African nation's independence? I mean, it's mind-boggling how exciting and fun and the opportunities that we all had. I think back on the Bureau, you know, I was there both when it was only in Carburton and when it split into Carburton and Great Portland Street. But I think what I remember, and I bet you a lot of people have said that more than anything else, was as you came out of an elevator, wherever you were, or up the stairs, was Norma or Pauline's voice on the phone. Often sweet-talking some operator in some distant land, somehow getting through. That's the other thing that's sort of hard to imagine is communications and how that's changed. In some ways, I joke that it's similar. It's sort of what, you know, the past is the future, whatever it is. The past is the present. I don't remember the cliche, but if you think back on how we used to use telexes to communicate with, say, Moscow in the old days when it was so hard to get a phone line, you'd have a telex conversation back and forth. Well, that's just what texting is now. And it's ironic that that was considered the sort of rough communications in those days and the only way to go through. But it really was. You'd sit there and you'd type, and then John McKenzie or whoever would type back, and then you'd type back, and you'd have this conversation. It took slightly longer than texting, but not actually much longer. But then, of course, we had those long pieces of paper. You know, and it was like the herograms that we used to get in the, you know, that would hang up there, and you'd go in the morning and check to see if, you know, anyone had commented on what you'd done or if you'd done something terrible, which was, of course, was there for everyone to see, whether it was good or bad. And I don't know. It was a special time. It was a special time. And as I say, I consider myself extraordinarily lucky to have grown up in that era when there was such possibility and such excitement and such enthusiasm and meaning in what we did.